Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Neda Zohdi and I'm the director of the Open Gov Hub. I'm really delighted to be welcoming each of you and introducing today's virtual panel event to discuss anti-corruption measures in a time of COVID. Most of you may already be familiar, but for anyone who isn't, the Open Gov Hub, which is organizing today's event, is a meeting place which brings together a wide variety of organizations and resources who share this common mission of opening up governments and empowering citizens around the world. And we support a network of 50 member organizations and about 300 people who are working collectively on this mission. And we provide resource sharing and opportunities to learn and work together. Today's event being a great example. So we're really delighted to be listening and learning from 3 of our member organizations about the different advocacy approaches that they're taking today to fight corruption risks during this time, particularly here in the United States and in Latin America. And of course, this is a very timely topic and an important one for us to be bringing our collective minds together around because of the scale of the impact and the stakes that are at risk. I'm just going to cover a couple housekeeping items here at the beginning. The first note is, as you all can probably see, we are live streaming and recording this event via YouTube, but we are using the webinar format in Zoom, which means that you as an attendee are automatically muted and off screen. So you can just see the panelists who are going to be speaking today. But we do encourage you throughout the session to actively use the Q&A function to share your questions with the panelists, as well as the chat box if you have any additional questions. So do please use both of those and we'll be actively monitoring them throughout the conversation. Now I'm really delighted to introduce our moderator for today's event, Abigail Bellows, who is a dear friend and colleague and friend of the Open Gov Hub, who we just hosted a few months ago for a roundtable in our office. Abigail is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she's also an independent consultant with the Open Society Foundations. Prior to that, she was with the US Department of State, where she created and led the anti-corruption portfolio in the Office of the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. So delighted to have you today, Abigail, and our panelists, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Neda. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to get right to the fun stuff and introduce our incredible panel. We have Gary Kalman, who directs the U.S. Office of Transparency International. He has a long history as an advocate on accountability and economic justice issues with previous leadership roles at the FACT Coalition and the Center for Responsible Lending, as well as U.S. PIRG. Next up, we have Lakshmi Kumar, who is the Policy Director of Global Financial Integrity. She previously worked with governments across South Asia, East Africa, and Eurasia on money laundering and terrorist finance risks to their financial systems, with a great deal of experience on investigations and drafting legislation as well. And finally, we have Dagmar Thiel, who directs the US Office of Fundamedios. She's an Ecuadorian-German journalist with experience on human rights issues, developing public-private alliances and sustainable development topics. Thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to our conversation. And we will start by doing 2 quick polls to get a sense of who is in the room. So Isabella, if you can launch the first poll. This is about which part of the world you focus on in your work, where your work is targeted, so that we can see who we have here, or where your interest most lies if you don't do this work professionally. Okay, I think we have a critical mass of respondents. So it seems that we have a fair share of participants who are focused on Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as North America and also Sub-Saharan Africa, which is wonderful. Okay, and then we're going to do one more poll here at the top, which is which kind of corruption and COVID risks are of most concern to you right now? So this is part of what sparked your interest in this topic. So Isabella, if you can go to the second poll. Give us a minute as we work on pulling that up. But I'll tell you as a preview, so you have it. Okay, you have it here. So which are the corruption related concerns during the COVID-19 response that are of most concern to you? So the first is about diversion of relief funds, the second around procurement irregularities and illicit flows, denial of services at the local level, politically motivated crackdowns, and issues related to misinformation, lack of transparency. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I think we will pause it there. So the majority of folks in this conversation are focused on diversion of COVID-19 relief and concerns related to that. But we also have a lot of participants interested in politically motivated crackdowns as well, alongside misinformation. So we will certainly get to many of those topics during our discussion, and it's great to hear that you're focused on those. So thanks very much. And we will jump right into our conversation. So X out of that. The first question will be for Gary. So we would love to learn more about, from your vantage point at the U.S. Office for Transparency International, in what ways do you see corruption as contributing to the spread of COVID-19 and hampering the effectiveness of response measures?
We're seeing a number of stories already come out. Domestically, there was just a story, well, actually came out a couple of weeks ago, but then more details came out today in the Washington Post, where $55 million contract was given to a company that is facing bankruptcy, has had no employees since 2018, and has actually never manufactured anything, despite the fact that the contract was supposed to be for delivering masks. Today it came out that no, the company is actually never going to deliver the masks and the contract is being revoked. But it is that kind of fraud that we are concerned about. How does it impact the virus? Well, it's very direct. That means that there are millions of masks that are not going to get delivered. And there's going to be exposure amongst first responders, public health officials, and others. I would say also that story is sort of the trifecta of all problems, in that not only was the company a scam company, a shell company, but it also turns out that they were charging about 10 times as much as legitimate companies. So they were charging over $5 a mask, and 3M and Honeywell were charging between 60 and 90 cents a mask. So on top of everything else, you're also looking at potential price gouging. So that's the kind of risks that we see with fraud and corruption.
Thank you. It's a terrifying instance, and not alone in the kind of scale of corruption concerns that we're seeing and the risk of diversion. So can you tell us a bit about what are some of the strategies that TI here in the US is using to try to address some of those corruption vulnerabilities, and how have those strategies been working? Where are you seeing success and where are you seeing challenges?
So working on both as an international organization, we're working on both the domestic and the international level. And given the groups on the call, I'll be very quick on the domestic because I know people are very interested in international efforts. So on the domestic level, obviously, largest spending bill we've ever had in our history. There, in the first round of spending, the bill did have some pretty good oversight provisions. There's a number of committees, inspectors general. There's obviously a going back and forth between the administration on how well they're going to be able to do their jobs, but the attempts in the bill were quite good on that respect. We think there's still a lot to be done. For example, we're pushing for things like expanded whistleblower protections. People, and especially essential workers, need to be able to feel like they could come forward. There's been other proposals. There was one just the other day, the CORE Act, led by Elizabeth Warren and some others, which would have extended that and allow whistleblowers to file with some of the independent commissions that were created, so people could have a non-biased and independent access for making sure that that information is heard and they have an opportunity to do it without facing retaliation. There's a number of other things I can go through, but let me also say that on the international level, just yesterday we were talking to folks at the International Monetary Fund, and they've taken some steps, but again, they need to take more. So the two things, for example, that they have done is they have started to be more transparent about how funding decisions are being made with emergency funding and putting that online and sharing those conversations, those deliberations. So that is helpful. They've also started to, on a contract by contract basis, requiring more auditing to be done through independent auditors, and they're working by country, whether that's to be done because there's legitimate auditing procedures within the country or alternative ways of doing that. But there's more that needs to be done. For example, we think that the contracts that they sign, the procurement contracts that they sign then to provide the services should be public. And we also want to make sure that they're collecting, and I saw that this was an interest of a lot of folks, the beneficial ownership information. We know that contracting in countries, in a lot of the developing countries, can be problematic, and shell companies that are secretly owned by corrupt officials tend to get contracts steered their way. In fact, I don't know if people saw this, but just a quick word, the World Bank put out a study, I think it was earlier this year in February or something, where they showed that an influx of aid money into a specific country, was correlated with a rise in the bank account deposits in secrecy jurisdictions like the Cayman Islands, etc. And so we know that money is flowing illicitly and being taken out of the country, and lives are at stake. The diversion of this money is a big deal. So we think that those provisions, publishing contracts, getting the beneficial ownership information, are two things that are not yet happening at the IMF, and we have been pushing them to do that.
That's great to hear. Somebody just asked in the chat for a link to the study, which I'm happy to share later. Thank you for providing all of these insights about what TI is focused on, both domestically and supporting international efforts towards transparency and increased disclosure. Really important. And I think in these moments, it's really the multilateral institutions that have the most leverage often and can work in solidarity with citizen activists to advance those measures. So we'll turn next to Lakshmi and hear a bit about, from the global financial integrity perspective, what are some of the ways in which you're seeing the problem manifest, corruption contributing to the spread of COVID-19 during this time, and the response to it?
Thanks, Abigail. Before I start, I should say it's always hard following Gary because he gets all the interesting stuff that I have jotted down ahead of me, and then I have to follow up. Nevertheless, from sort of where we stand at global financial integrity, I think the way corruption has influenced COVID-19 is sort of a four-step process. It's one at the cause, the root cause itself, which is, sort of the spread of the pandemic. And there's been so much conversation around sort of the role of trafficking in all of this, and how sort of, the absence of any norms globally on trade-based money laundering, even for us, the United States, has been sort of a big mover in sort of spreading COVID-19 across the globe, and maybe the cause of the pandemic. I think at the second stage is what all of us are now focused on, which is, what is happening with sort of the stimulus package in terms of, We see recovery packages all over the world, and there's a concern about where this money is going. Domestically, our companies benefiting. The third stage of this for us as a concern is the US's role as a financial center, which means that we are also worried about the US illicit money economy growing as corrupt individuals and kleptocrats and others use this opportunity to divert funds back into the US. And because of our own weak sort of beneficial ownership regimes, this makes it easier. As an organization, we work sort of in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And to just give you an example, Argentina is about to default for the 9th time its debt packages that was given to it. And the current administration, the Kirchner administration, has a set of companies with a Nevada-based company formation agent. 90% of their companies that they form are dormant. They don't do anything. They don't have a function. And they have over 100 entities registered in the US through this outfit. And the corruption cases against the government in Argentina have stalled for 10 years and now they're back in power. So that's a huge concern for us. And the final plank is that, while we see all of this benefit from COVID-19 and can be tied to stimulus packages, there is just corruption and money laundering that will happen irrespective of if you're not receiving a package, but that will just use sort of the chaos that is ongoing to benefit. So that really is the 4 planks at which we're approaching this from sort of the US, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think it's important to remember that in addition to the pandemic-related corruption, there's all the crimes of opportunity that might occur during this time as regulators are working from their living rooms and less focused on these issues. Can you give us a sense of what some of the response measures are that GFI has started to consider, of the strategies that you all are deploying to address some of those 4 risks?
No, certainly. For starters, I think, this for us, in the US, we are slightly slowly and surely building an appetite for trade-based money laundering, and the fact that, the source of the pandemic can be tied to trade. The US is the 2nd biggest destination for wildlife trafficking. China will be the first. China serves both as a source, but the US is the 2nd biggest destination. So there's a lot for us to sort of look inwards. And, as Gary and I and others, we work on pushing beneficial ownership into the financial system. Beneficial ownership on the trade side is unavailable anywhere in the world. Customs and Border Protection officials, even within the US, don't have it. Now, the oversight side, Gary already mentioned sort of the PPP issue. The one thing that sort of the FinCEN has done is FinCEN has scrapped cash transaction reporting for the moment. And we are seeing a huge increase in just general bulk cash smuggling and money laundering across our borders at this point. So the one thing that we wanted to recommend, and I think we're trying to push for, is that instead of the CTR, FinCEN should consider a COVID-19 specific alert.
Sorry, what's the CTR?
A CTR is a currency transaction report. And this is something financial institutions do every time there are large cash deposits, along with what's called a suspicious transaction report. Now, they have sort of suspended that for the moment, and you see a huge increase in reports of bulk cash smuggling. And so I think our suggestion is, instead of suspending it, is to create a new alert that is COVID-19 specific, that would allow FinCEN to investigate. And, FinCEN has had a history of doing this. At the height of our opioid crisis, FinCEN did have sort of specific alerts for financial institutions where they could report something that was tied back to the opioid crisis. Similarly, as Gary mentioned, of the beneficial ownership, the PPP language is something which has talked about, not doing due diligence for customers that already have an account, or doing a certain kind of diligence for new customers. I think the approach should be to do a retroactive sort of, to able to release the funds, but then to go back and do a review, as opposed to sort of creating safe harbor provisions where you just don't have to do a review at all. And you have instances, as Gary mentioned, companies that have no employees getting the benefits, and they may already be existing customers whose beneficial ownership has never been verified. And I think the last plank that we're working on is, as we move away from things, we are trying to look at commodities that can be substituted instead of cash. And both in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, what we see is the use of gold, because gold is fungible. It's a cash intensive business. It's a bearer instrument. So you can't map identity. I could transfer it between me, Gary, Dagmar, and Abigail, and no one will know where the gold came from. And we see like countries like Venezuela, which is moving, the Maduro regime is already moving so much gold to Turkey and into Uganda. So we see a lot of those movements. And so I think, in our case, we've sort of tried to sort of push some of this with USG, but we're also in talks with sort of the OECD, the UN, the World Economic Forum, and we've had some conversations with IOSCO, which is the body that regulates sort of commodity markets and capital markets.
Fabulous. Thanks for sharing all that, the importance of tracking these new forms of currency transactions, increasing due diligence, creating new alerts for COVID. So we really appreciate that. We'll turn next to get an initial sense from Dagmar about what the view is from her vantage point from Fundamedios. What are you seeing as the ways corruption or lack of transparency is most of concern right now during the pandemic?
Thanks, Abigail. Well, I think one of the things that make us have a great concern is that the virus is not only killing people around the world, but it's murdering the access to verified information. It's murdering the right the citizens have to access information. And that's probably very hard if we're trying to get all these cases of corruption or Gary and Lakshmi were talking about to light. And there are 5 points I would highlight here. And that's right now people are turning to the media outlets to get information because the governments are hiding information and because the citizens are in despair. They need transparent information. But what's happening is that independent media and quality journalism is dying. Thousands of journalists around the world have lost their jobs. Many media outlets are shutting their doors, and they were already on the verge of collapse due to the social media and the free digital news media mode that Facebook and Google started. So they are now trying to survive, but many of these media outlets aren't there anymore. And this gap for trusted information is being filled by interested parties or by a lot of disinformation. We have more disinformation than ever on internet. Only in April, we had 40 million of statements in Facebook that were tagged as false. And the Coronavirus Data Alliance has been tracking in 54 countries, more 5,000 falsehoods in this month. So this is just the way this is spreading. And you've got in this information, you've got first about the origin of the coronavirus and what kind of conspiracy theories are behind that. And that depends on what side of the globe you're sitting. If you blame China or if you blame the Americans. Then you've got this information with political purposes. And then you've got like Mr. Trump or Mr. Jair Bolsonaro or Ortega doing their narrative around COVID and what they want to get with this information. Or for example, in the United Kingdom, where towers of 5G were taken down because people were saying that coronavirus was spread over the 5G towers. You've got also this information about miraculous cures and medicines that can do any kind of solutions. Oh, and that's not true. And one thing that's very concerning is that due to this virus, many authoritarian governments are taking emergency rules to control the pandemic. But on these emergency rules, they are harming fundamental rights and fundamental rights for journalists to access to transparent information, to cover information, to go to hospitals and try to see what's happening, to access to verified data from the government, to access the press briefings that are being held online, to make questions. And in many places, journalists or activists are being threatened, are being harassed. In El Salvador, it's one of the great examples of what's happening in this regard. And finally, there's so much going on, so much corruption going on, where as Gary told about this company that got this incredible relief. There are examples of masks being bought with 9,000% surcharge, or other cases of corruption that need to be brought to light. And if you don't have independent journalism and watchdogs to do this, how will the world know about what is happening? So this is eroding the independent information and our access as citizens to transparency.
Thank you. It's a disturbing convergence of the challenges that independent media has faced for a long time with the crisis, and those who are seeking to use emergency measures to further restrict those kinds of points of access. So I would be curious to hear what are some of the strategies that Fundamedios and others, your partners, have been deploying so far to address some of these risks. Are there things that have been working and trying to push back on some of these restrictions?
Well, one of the most important things is fact-checking. We are part of the international fact-checking network, and it's fundamental to have to just see what's false and what's true, and to try the truth to get out. So that's very important. And we also call all the citizens not to spread any information they get, but to have it checked and to see around if this is real. We also are engaging with networks to support independent journalists and journalists in need, not only on the financial side, but also on the mental health. They are going through very tough times, reporting on such tough things like that. So they need a lot of support. And of course, financially, it's very important. And I will quote a journalist from the LA Times who said, like on the flying, journalists have to have their oxygen mask first on to help others. So in terms of corruption, it would be very, very important to give journalism oxygen so they can talk about corruption. So anybody who can support journalism, please do it.
Thank you. Yeah, you have to put your own mask on first before you can help others, especially if we want them to be independent and not corruptible. So thanks for sharing that. We're gonna now circle back to our panelists for some rapid fire thoughts on a question about the future. What you see as some of the biggest remaining gaps when you think about the next 6 months of how we're gonna respond to these corruption COVID intersections. And are there particular actions that you're looking for civil society groups, for activists, and for policymakers to take in responding to some of those threats? So we'll go in the same order as before, turning first to Gary.
Yeah, so a few things I would say. I think one is picking up on something Lakshmi said, which we have to be, and it also aligns with some of the concerns Dagmar raised, is I think we need to be not just, we obviously need to be proactive and be pushing a lot of the things that we're talking about here, but we also need to be worried about these attacks. And Lakshmi said, they've suspended these cash transaction reports, and so we've seen more bulk smuggling. We've also seen a push by some of the financial institutions in the United States to completely suspend anti-money laundering checks writ large. So not just these CTRs, as she said, but everything. And we actually drill down on that, just to take a minute on this, because I think it's important for us to do that, is they were saying that the anti-money laundering checks were slowing down the movement of the money. And this is such a crisis that we need to move this money as quickly as possible, and any delay is going to cost lives. And so we started to look into it, and it turns out that it wasn't the actual collection of the driver's license or the, information itself that was slowing down the process. That is, business owners clearly had this documentation in their back pockets and they can just provide it. It was that the way the form was written, that they had a multi-step collection process. So we said, well, what happens if you just collect all this information during the application process? They, oh, well, that would save a week. I was like, well, just do that.
Yeah.
So, right. So I think that we are going to face a whole series of, this is slowing the process down and we can't afford to do that. We even heard one staff person on the Hill say, look, even if fraudsters get the money, they're still going to be spending it, so it'll still spur the economy, so I don't care. Right. So we can unpack that in another session. But
Yeah.
but my point is that I do think that it is important for journalists and others to actually dig down on some of these claims, because that I think is a big danger moving forward, is we're going to say we can't afford anti-corruption measures. The other thing I would say is that we can't afford not to have them. And, we talk about all the problems we're seeing. I do want to just say, because I think it's important to note here, that anti-corruption measures actually can work. So there was a study done by the GAO comparing Katrina spending to Sandy spending after the hurricanes. So both of it is emergency spending, lots of money, now not nearly as much money as we're spending now, but a substantial amount, billions and billions of dollars. And in Katrina, the money went out very quickly. There were some anti-corruption measures, but fewer. And in Sandy, they had more. Well, the GAO found that between 10 and 22% of the money in Katrina was lost to fraud and corruption. They don't know because there was such sloppy oversight that they don't actually know, but you're talking about between 10 and 20% of the money just lost to corruption. Under Sandy, because there was better accounting, they can actually say, 2.7% of the money was lost to corruption. If you graph that onto the money that's being spent in the CARES Act alone, you're talking about a loss of between $200 and $300 billion. So this is not small money, and anti-corruption measures can make a difference. So as we sort of move forward, I mean, we can get into the specific policies if you're interested in that, but I think that there are broader issues here about the fact that anti-corruption measures are not what's slowing things down. There are ways of doing them where we can make, maybe it slows it down by a day or something, but we're not substantially threatening anyone's lives by doing this. And in fact, if you're talking about $200 or $300 billion going to people who actually need it, then you are in fact saving lives. And I think we need to be very clear about that. So
I think it's very, very valuable to lift up that we need smart anti-corruption measures that really are streamlined and efficient. And we need to win the narrative campaign. We need to contest this narrative that anti-corruption is a luxury that we don't have time for, but in fact is something that we must create space for. So thank you for sharing that. We'll turn next to Lakshmi. What are some of your thoughts as you think about the next 6 months, this horizon ahead of us? What are some of the actions that society and others to take?
So, much like Gary said, and to give you a sort of a specific example, because we have people sort of from Latin and Caribbean here, the Bahamas has suspended its bio-verification legislation. They've just suspended it in its entirety. And so, again, that is a risk. Again, it goes back to the point of the US is already sort of, number 2 in the world for acting as sort of a safe haven for illicit flows. And, things like that become problematic because then on the starting end, you have no check. And on the finishing end of things, we also have no checks because we don't have checks. Just when and then when we start talking about these huge volumes of money moving through the financial system, SWIFT codes all over the world still don't disclose beneficial ownership information when payments are made from one part to another. So as you start suspending beneficial ownership checks, the next stage of the process that kicks in when you talk about financial payments, there's no safeguards there. And then, to sort of circle back on the theme because I think there's sort of an interest in sort of understanding how, as we sort of are switching to other commodities, like gold and others, what we are seeing is that, that people are using, and, this is a huge black hole for the US, is people use private airplanes to move a lot of this stuff. We've seen people carry 200 kilos in gold out of Sudan. We are looking at data of Colombian gold being flown into the US. And in the US, private planes can all be registered to an anonymous LLC, an anonymous company. And, those are things that, because Gary and I work very closely on beneficial ownership, but that's not even part of the rubric of what we're talking about. But as, these are sort of opportunity costs that, we think that the time is ripe because there is an interest right now in talking about, okay, what caused all of this? What can we do better to maybe shift the focus to sort of, where these things start with trade. And the one last thing I will say about, in terms of the relief that we're talking about in the US is that, we've dedicated over $2 trillion within the CARES Act. And, just comparing the 2009 relief package that the US government did, that was at about, $484 billion. So we're talking about a budget that is 2.5 times bigger, yet in terms of oversight, there's less money in this package than there was in the '09 relief package. We are short by over 67 million, and that should be just a glaring thing for all of us to look at and question.
Thank you. Really important points to keep in mind. And I will be circling back to you in the Q&A section for a question around oversight that came up in the chat. And Dagmar, give us your thoughts around civil society and journalists as you look ahead towards the next 6 months. What are some of the big gaps or opportunities that you're seeing on the horizon?
Well, I'm probably very pessimistic, because all the media industry was already so harmed before the crisis. And if we talk about the US, there were almost 35,000 news organizations, employees nationwide that were already furloughed or laid off. And there are more than 1,800 communities without any kind of news source. And nowadays, you need news sources around you locally to tell you where is the nearest hospital, what are the county's regulations regarding social distancing or staying at home, and what's happening. And all these news sources that aren't there anymore, and all those that will shut additionally, they won't be there to keep authorities accountable. So there is a very important pending issue to support kind of information. And with this stimulus packages, 80% of the news organization, of the newspapers, they weren't able to get the money because they were already concentrated in big corporations that were too big to get the funding. So they were too big to have any kind of support, but they will let die the small local news media that already they own. And on the other hand, there is also the ethic question. Should independent media take money from the government, from the stimulus packages? My personal view is probably yes, because it's not the government, although it can come with a signature beyond, but it's from the taxpayers, and it's from all the community to have the media and the journalists still working and doing this watchdog work that we are supposed to do. So I think it's going to be essential for people, for civil society, support all the efforts to have independent media still alive.
Yeah. Whether it's through consumers of the media directly or through taxpayer sources.
The readers, or whatever, but it's
exactly.
It's important. It's
yeah,
key.
Real financial crisis right now. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so we're gonna jump now into your questions. So we'll be shifting to use of the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen in Zoom. And the way it works is that you can post a question, and in addition to coming up with your own questions, you can vote up questions that you particularly are interested in hearing answered. So in that way, we can make sure we cover the questions that have the biggest demand behind them. And so we'll turn first to the question that was posed by Will, I believe, from Strategies for Humanity. The US Congress has established a select committee to oversee COVID response monies. If other countries have similar oversight efforts, could you share any lessons from them? So open to any views from folks on the panel, but maybe we'll start with Lakshmi in case you have ideas, lessons from other countries that we can take on board here in the US regarding oversight.
Okay, yeah, can you hear me now? I was struggling
yes.
to sort of unmute myself. Yeah. So there are a couple of things. One, the IMF has a policy tracker for government responses to COVID-19. So I think it's a sort of global view of what's going on within each government. So I deal a lot in the financial and trade space, and so I think, at least as far as oversight of the stimulus package goes, I think that's something we focus more in the US. But I think in terms of sort of the roles that FIUs and other bodies have done, one has been a lot of governments have issued red flags or risks that financial institutions and people involved in the financial and trade system should assess, especially on the lookout for COVID-19. I think, you know, in the US, we have, FinCEN has provided sort of some sort of guidance. We haven't really fleshed it out yet. So I think that's something we could look at. I know the FATF just released sort of a compendium of responses around COVID-19 and increased money laundering risks, what could be increased corruption risks. So I think that's something, you know, in general, if people are sort of trying to look for how you can advocate within your government, I think those are sort of good places to sort of get information from, because they're very broad, and then you can fine tune it to sort of your needs. I particularly found the Dutch FIU has got some great ideas out there. They've put as advisories and guidance for their financial institutions to take a look at. So I would sort of, you know, recommend that also, that are interested in sort of understand more broadly.
Okay, great. Any other comments on that? And along a similar vein, Andrew Peters asked about success stories of oversight from various countries, spending oversight of COVID-19 relief. Gary, any comments on success stories or lessons that we should be taking on board here?
Yeah, so I don't have success stories yet, although I think that is a great question. I think one of the only thing I would add to what Lakshmi said, which I completely agree with, is that a lot of the oversight that we focus on is, you know, after the fact. So the IMF says, oh, you know, we're going to do audits afterwards. And so that is helpful because there will be audits, and so people will assume that there will be accountability. But for a lot of crooks and fraudsters and corrupt officials, they've already taken the money, and if they're good at covering their tracks with anonymous and secret financial flows, it's gone. And so I do think that you need to be concerned about what's both upfront and back end. And that's why we so talk about the beneficial ownership collection upfront, the posting of contracts. In terms of commissions, we need to make sure that they have access to the information. In the United States, that's subpoena power, to make sure that you could get real-time information and be looking at that. So I guess I would just say that in addition to the back end, after post-facto assessments, that we also need to do some upfront collection of information and making that public to try and dissuade the fraud at both ends.
Thank you. It is similar to the COVID-19 response in that we want prevention as opposed to just autopsies afterwards. We want to try to prevent the problems or the deaths from occurring. So we'll turn next to this question that Daniel Mule posted, particularly to Gary and Lakshmi, asking about the good governance commitments in the new IMF packages. Some of them address audits, beneficial ownership, contract transparency, but there's a lot of range. So how are you imagining conditionality as it proceeds in terms of our advocacy towards the IMF? Maybe we'll go to Gary on that because I know TI has been very involved, but then anybody else can chime in.
Sure, although Lakshmi, I know you deal a lot with the IMF, so you may have more to say than me on this. I guess I would say a couple of things. First of all, IMF contracts, for folks that are familiar, they know that there are, and I'm not as up on my terminology as I should be, but there's these benchmarks which are more suggestions than they are actual conditionality of loans, meaning we're going to pull the loan or we're going to call in the loan early, or we're going to deny you, or, you know, look at, that's going to have an impact on future lending. So the biggest thing, I think, when the IMF came out with some of these guidelines and all that, the things that I was saying are the audit, well, actually the audits are being done on a case-by-case basis, but I think they're being pretty good about that. In terms of the beneficial ownership, posting contracts, some of the procurement transparency, that's all recommended. It's not, those are benchmark type, you know, things. And so it's advice, it's not an encouragement, but it is not part of the protocols, and it's not a conditionality of the grant. So I think we need to move from suggestion to commitment that you're going to do it. And I think that in the there's currently a series of special vehicles, lending vehicles that they've created. I think as much as I would like to see all this put into those vehicles, I think my conversations so far, and Lakshmi, correct me if I'm wrong, it's going to be really hard. But what we've heard is there's going to very likely be a second round. The countries are going to come back for a second round of loans and a second round of funding. And if we start now, we could get these conditions into that next round. And so we need to be building for that. So there's a couple of thoughts. Lakshmi?
Oh, no, I was going to say, I've sort of very little to add to that. I thought, Gary did sort of a great job. The only thing I would sort of add, it's for the IMF, but sort of a larger conversation on the audits is that, even prior to this, we really have struggled with sort of audits and accounting and sort of all the AML risks tied to that. And I would be interested to see sort of, how those existing risks sort of get exacerbated through this process, because they've sort of always existed and very little has been done around sort of accounting and auditing risks in general. Because, there is, after Arthur Andersen, there's then just been this general culture of, we're too worried that if someone fails, what will we all do? So there's sort of a lot of sort of, been hand holding around for accounting firms. And I think the question of audit automatically raises the larger question of the responsibility of accounting firms and how very little has been done on it.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, Gary, go ahead.
One quick thing, Abigail, which you will appreciate, because there's one other thing that would be very helpful that was written by you, as a matter of fact, in one of your blogs. And we've actually included that in some of our asks to the IMF and to USAID when they're putting out funding. And that is, we talk about audits, and as Lakshmi said, a lot of countries struggle with this because their infrastructure, their technology, their computers are just not what they need. To get billions of dollars or millions of dollars rather into this particular country, they can't manage it. And so we've actually called, and you recommended this, that we provide a certain amount of funding for infrastructure to make sure that we could track and manage, so that they have the technology and the ability to manage this money in a way, even if there's not corruption, it's just lost to the fact that they can't manage the money. So that's another piece to the puzzle as we're thinking about this, that not only helps in the immediate crisis, but also would then put in place systems that they can manage money going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. And it's great that you mentioned the auditors and accountants and the lack of accountability that they face long-term, Lakshmi, because that's a perennial challenge that has only become heightened in this time. So we're going to go next to a question that Ewan Grant raised around international tension between the US and China over WHO matters, how that might be impacting cross-border cooperation. And I think I'll take this question expansively to look also about cross-border cooperation between journalists. And I'll turn to you on this, Dagmar, because so often these investigations, when they really work, they start because organizations like OCCRP and ICIJ and other international consortiums of investigative journalists are the ones exposing problems of corruption and then passing it to law enforcement and so on. So I'm curious, during this pandemic or more broadly, if you've noticed any trends in how international cooperation has been evolving within the journalist space or more broadly.
No, definitely. The coronavirus crisis has brought a lot of journalistic groups and like bigger concerns together to do collaborative work, and this will be very, very important, as it was for the Panama Papers and other kinds of investigations that brought to light corruption cases. So there are collaborative work that is going on, and it's the most important, and it's being funded by donors and foundations that want to strengthen journalism. So that's the only way to have this right now. I can hear you. Your mic is out.
Sorry. Thank you for that. Anything to add on that international cooperation question from Gary or Lakshmi?
My screen just froze for a second there. No, I was going to say, the international cooperation is an important angle because US tensions with China are also being reflected with now Australia having tensions with China. And that sort of, it's changing the way supply chain mechanics work. It's changing sort of, tariff structures and costs. And, there are sort of huge that's a government issue, but it has huge real life people costs for sort of individuals, both for sort of, food costs, basic commodity costs. And I think those are sort of worrying concerns for us, because at the same time as we sort of, an uptick in this, we see, oil prices plunging, but we see we see gold prices booming sky high because there's so much money being shoved and hidden into gold so as a safeguard. So there are sort of, both sort of real life consequences to all of this. And the one thing I think that has sort of been missed out in this broader conversation, I know, is that East Africa has had a huge locust infestation. So on top of everything else, there is a genuine issue with what food shortage means. And once we start putting all these commodities into a larger conversation about money laundering risks, there are sort of real consequences to these political tensions that can play out that we aren't thinking about.
Great. So I think we're going to do one last question and then do a poll as part of our way of wrapping up. So I wanted to get this question from Elizabeth Meehan, which is about the private sector. We talked a lot today about government and the way in which government can be more attentive to corruption risk. But what are some of the trends that you're seeing from the supply side, from those who might be bidding on contracts or otherwise responsible for the bribe paying in some way or collusion? Are you seeing shifts in how they're approaching compliance, either voluntary compliance or government prompted compliance? Any thoughts on that? Any of the panelists?
Sure, Gary, you go first.
He said, go ahead.
Okay, sure. No, so, that's an interesting question, because you would think that in many ways, and I can't speak to the US, I can speak to sort of supply chains that might be coming into the US and supply chains that are going sort of between countries outside the US, is with government oversight. Supply chains are always risky for corruption, especially at the customs. So with more government hands on things, it means that there are increased opportunity for rent seeking and corrupt behavior. And that's something the private sector is having to deal with in a heightened fashion more now than before. So that's something that I think we've been hearing.
Yeah, I mean, other people may have, who are part of this briefing and participating, may have even more knowledge about this, but my understanding is, from what I've seen, is there's certainly a number of opportunistic companies, and we've seen, for example, large companies applying for the small business loans, and there's a debate over whether or not they, how large are you before you stop getting the money? We've also seen concerns about companies in the United States that have inverted, right? So they've moved offshore for the purposes of avoiding tax, but they have a subsidiary in the United States, and that subsidiary is, has a majority of its employees in the United States, and so they've been applying for, bailout money, and there's a question as to whether or not that should be legit, right? And unfortunately, the Federal Reserve came down with, in my opinion, a bad decision. So there's definitely opportunistic companies that are trying to take advantage, I would say. But in terms of I think the larger threat, I'm going to say this, I could be wrong, but I think the larger threat is actually more the outright fraud and scams and corruption that we're seeing. I think the fake companies, the contracts are just moving so quickly, and there's so little oversight that the losses that we're talking about, I think, from corruption are going to far outweigh, some of the sort of more opportunistic of the legitimate companies. For example, on the mask problem that I said earlier, it was interesting that 3M and Honeywell were actually charging between 60 and 90 cents per mask. So, you have some examples of companies that are definitely making money off the crisis. Like they're making money off of that, but it's within the realm of, we need the masks and we're paying for it. It's a legitimate price. So anyway, that's my sense, although we'll see. I mean, the oversight committees could find that that's completely wrong. And at the end of the day, the price gouging from legitimate companies was just as bad. So we don't know that just yet.
Thank you. There was a couple questions that we weren't able to get to, unfortunately. So feel free, if anybody has thoughts on those questions, to respond to them in the chat. But as we wrap up, I think we could all do with a little bit of hope. So Isabella is going to queue up poll number 4, which is about what potential windows of opportunity or positive outcomes could we imagine emerging from this pandemic to make more progress in the future on corruption. So please take a look at those options and weigh in. Okay, so the poll results are in. The top answer was the possible heightened public awareness about the risk of corruption in public spending and aid flows that could emerge from this period. But also a lot of people think that there could be increased coalition building within civil society and new partnerships that are formed during this time, which is hopeful as well, alongside these other factors. So it is exciting and encouraging to see some of those positive scenarios that we could expect from this period, and how we can all work towards tilting things in that positive trajectory, in addition to responding to all of the obvious and serious negative threats we have during this time. So I will just conclude with a couple of the takeaways for me from our expert panelists today. As they reflected on some of the problems that they're seeing right now in the pandemic landscape. They highlighted the risks of outright fraud and collusion in procurement processes, as well as in aid flows. We talked about the opportunistic crimes not related to the pandemic, but that might flourish during this period of less scrutiny. And the overall lack of oversight, both from government actors as well as from journalists, who are often our conscience on a lot of these issues and expose them first. And journalists are facing both the long-term trends that have long threatened their profession, as well as the heightened risks of emergency measures and others during this time. And then finally, we heard about some of the exciting strategies being deployed by civil society advocates around the world in terms of leveraging the power of donors like the IMF to potentially impose not just recommendations in the future, but perhaps harsher conditionality measures to really uphold high standards in their lending, and ways in which to strengthen oversight bodies, both formal and journalistic independent oversight functions through better support for independent media, as well as caring for each other. I'll just lift up something that Dagmar said right at the end, which is the need for mental health support for a lot of the frontline activists and journalists that are doing this work. So I think on that note, let's all be kind to each other and try to continue supporting each other as we go forward in this work. And a big thanks to the Open Gov Hub for hosting us, and stay tuned on their email list for future events related to these themes. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much to everybody. Keep safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.